man takes the law into his own hands, hunting down the criminals who brutally attack his family, killing his wife. This week we look at Death Wish, a film made in 1974 with Charles Bronson that saw a remake recently with Bruce Willis in 2018. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hello.
And I think before we get into the movies themselves, I think one of the things that kind of has come up a few times is this idea, like, what really separates between revenge and justice? You know, like, kind of what is that kind of fine line or dividing line?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that both of these movies, the 74 and the 2017, really look at, both in different ways. In the 74, it's justice is meted out in a kind of a Western style, Old West, there is no law way of gunslinger. And even he's referencing himself as a gunslinger a lot of it in the movie.
Yeah.
And the 2017 version, it's more society will potentially fail enacting justice for you, and you may have to sort of empower yourself to do this. Slightly different kind of messages I felt in both movies. I don't know what your feeling was on those.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, when you go back to the Old Testament, right, not to get too religious, but at the same time, I think there is a kind of separation that we've seen between the Old Testament and New Testament of, like, kind of where the kind of Moses kind of, biblical kind of justice is an eye for an eye. That's very much like kind of, you know, built into like kind of our justice system a lot. At the same time, in theory, like kind of with like whether you're talking about the once and future king and all that, where might is not necessarily right. It's different times, like we want to like come up with a justice that like tries to rebalance things, tries to because when somebody's killed, like killing somebody else just means that you have two people dead. It doesn't bring back the other person by killing this other. So that's the thing that, like, in theory, we want to try to restore and stuff. But of course, again, like kind of there's that thing of where when somebody's gone, like, what can you really do, right, to kind of compensate for that and stuff? Like certainly
very true.
There's like I think what was interesting with like kind of the OJ Simpson case was they had the criminal prosecution, and then they went to like a civil case where they had a wrongful death lawsuit to basically go after those finances, just try to basically restore things a little bit of the balance of where hey, here's this person who was killed, so we're gonna go after your finances because that'll like kind of maybe restore things to the survivors and stuff like that. But even then, like kind of, I think it's like really ultimately, like kind of, I don't think there really is any way to like balance things in a true sense. I think the only thing that we kind of try to do is to just mete out what we call justice, which is often the case of like having somebody like kind of being taken out off the streets and, not being able to kind of, do harm to others and stuff. And that's like probably the closest thing we come to, which I think causes the frustration that people have because different times our attitude is, hey, like, I've lost a loved one and stuff, but meanwhile, this person is getting free meals, for the rest of their lives and stuff. How is that justice and stuff?
Yeah, no, I think you're right in terms of how both of these movies look at justice and how it's dealt with in interesting ways. In that we know in general society that when someone, you're trying to redress this balance that you're talking about, we know that simply an eye for an eye isn't going to work.
Right.
But it has a very, very powerful subconscious draw on people. And there's this thing of, well, and this is why I think what's so powerful about the 74 movie is that it's kind of this guy saying, okay, now it's going to be eye for an eye, and I'm going to go and redress the balance the way I see fit. It's almost like these are stories of people who've decided to redefine justice personally for them in whatever's happened in there. And to some degree, you identify with those person that in 70, especially in the 74, there's this vicarious sort of enjoyment of him going out and actively hunting down these criminals because he's feeding that subconscious kind of eye for an eye justice that is very sort of a powerful thing that I think anyone who was in that kind of situation would feel.
Yeah, I think vicarious is a really good word because, you know, the original spawned off like a bunch of like, you know, sequels and stuff. We didn't, you know, I didn't watch any of them and stuff, but there was like a Death Wish 2, 3, 4, like, you know, so that was apparently like quite a series that kind of, you know, and I think, you know, let's face it, you know, like kind of when there is a kind of franchise built like that and stuff, to me, that signals that like, you know, it's tapping into something deeper that
Definitely.
like people do, you know, like kind of this desire that people have, you know, whether to vicariously, you know, kind of seek the thrill of like kind of, you know, getting revenge or, you know, like kind of basically, you know, living through this person who's, you know, becoming a vigilante and stuff. So there was, I think, between the two movies, there was a case where a New Yorker basically kind of did something similar in real life. I forget the name. I think it was like Bernhard Goetz or something like that. And he apparently like, you know, was a real life vigilante. And it really kind of like sparked up a lot of controversy, just kind of like, you know, just in the movie we see Charles Bronson's character sparking off these kind of debates and stuff. And that's kind of something what really happened in real life with this Bernhard Goetz and stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's one that definitely the 2017 looks at really interesting in a good way, is this idea of if you do decide to sort of go down the route of being a vigilante and meting out justice personally, how do you check yourself that you're doing things correctly or you're making the right decision, and how is that decision interpreted, and how does the media portray your actions, because you may have really thought this out, but it does look into the permutations of how wrong things could potentially go as a vigilante, how you could screw up, or how you could, you know, kill the wrong person, or how your good actions could be, well, good all being relative, you know, how they're portrayed. So.
Right. I mean, I think that's another interesting aspect of it, is how, you know, the question that comes right off the bat is, you know, like when you make that kind of decision on the spot, you know, to be judge, jury, and executioner stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, like, are you sure, you know, like you're killing a, you know, legitimate, you know, criminal and stuff, or are you just kind of basically like something that like, you know, maybe you misconstrued and then like, and that's something that we didn't really see, I think, in either movie, of a case that was like kind of, you know, where things got mixed up or something like that, but that could very well happen. And I think in, you know, in both movies, they kind of made it where like, you know, the people were clearly, you know, quote unquote dirtbags and kind of, you know, just going after like kind of innocent, you know, kind of civilians, that kind of thing and stuff.
Yeah, no, it's very black and white in the movies, which is, I mean, it's a shame really that they could have gone for something more in a more grey area with the 2017 remake, which would have been good. But I mean, it's easy in a way for critics to look at the 1974 one and say, well, this is kind of, you know, you could, at a superficial level, you can say this is like a male power fantasy that's just been sort of displayed on screen. But I think there is something, if you look a little bit deeper with that, I think, as you touched on just now, this idea of being judge, jury, and executioner is actually something that a lot of people kind of subconsciously want to do. And I think also the idea of having that much certainty and having that much sort of bravery and ability to go out and actually be that person is something that has a very kind of powerful subconscious draw on people.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting how, even though that's our fantasy and our subconscious and stuff, one of the things I've learned from the military is that, like, you know, people often have those and ideas about like kind of, you know, what it's like to kind of kill somebody and stuff like that. And then a lot of times they are traumatized afterwards. It's only like kind of after they actually look into the eyes of somebody like kind of that they've killed and stuff like that, that then that all changes. And I think that's one of the things that, like, it is interesting how between the two versions and stuff, probably if anything, you know, with the new version with Bruce Willis and everything, here's a doctor, right? Here's somebody who they're sworn to kind of like preserve life and stuff. And meanwhile, he had to flip the switch of like kind of, you know, like all of a sudden he's like going out to people and stuff. And that's something that was, I think, they did a good job of reflecting, you know, like kind of that wasn't necessarily an easy decision. If anything, I feel like they kind of did a great job of kind of reflecting how, like, you know, some part of them kind of had to snap for that to happen and stuff. Whereas for, I think, the original with Charles Bronson, and we kind of talked a little bit before, you know, kind of starting and stuff, that like there's probably something about it that he kind of almost seemed to enjoy it a little too much and stuff.
Well, I mean, I would say both of them are actually pretty cynical in that respect. In that, in the 1974 one, after his daughter gets sort of committed to the asylum, he's just like, right, it's time for me to go out and get my revenge on society. And and in the Bruce Willis one, he actually does a pretty good job of portraying this. If you actually notice, before his family gets attacked, he's very kind of robotic. He doesn't smile very much, and he's just kind of like going about his days. And he's actually starts smiling and enjoying himself, and sort of looks like he's actually enjoying life after he starts killing people.
Right.
And actually, there's actually a little hint of that as well in the 74 version. In that the son-in-law comes around and he's repainted his house. He's playing music and going, "Hey, let me cook you dinner." Right. It's almost like by dinner. I think they're sort of trying to make this point of, if, you know, by denying some part of ourselves where we hold ourselves back by what are the constraints of society, we lose a little bit of what makes us perhaps authentic as human hunter-gatherer animals, hunters, or something like this. It's kind of what both of them, but I would say more powerfully, the 2017 kind of taps into this.
I feel like that with the original, with Charles Bronson, his character was actually a psychopath. And this is something we've talked about in the past, that he, you know, was following the rules and stuff. And they've shown that with, you know, sociopaths, psychopaths, that these are, you know, what we typically associate with those you know, borderline personalities is that, like, they're kind of, you know, serial killers who, like, you know, have no regard for, like, kind of societal laws and stuff. And in reality, these folks do know that, like, they do understand consequences and stuff. What they don't have is they don't have remorse or a feeling of, you know, empathy for somebody that they're kind of inflicting suffering on stuff. And we see that, like, you know, both cases, you know, they're like kind of not killers, you know, like kind of when things are starting off and everything. In fact, Charles Bronson's character is, you know, said to be a conscientious objector and stuff. I think he's was in the medical corps and stuff as well, or okay. So there was an interesting kind of medical connection and stuff. And in both cases, like, you know, then it was this catalyst, right? That kind of they meet, like in the first one, it was the father-in-law, or was it both? No, it was real estate developer, the first one, and then the second one was the real estate developer who, like, basically shows them what it's like to, you know, shoot, you know, like kind of a gun, I guess, and like kind of, and that's like kind of the trigger, right? That's the switch that kind of, from then on, like kind of things became different and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite sort of politically heavy-handed in the 74 version. Because it's almost like the real estate developer from the South sort of empowers our character with a gun and sort of says, you know, this is how we deal with things, you know, down South, you know, we deal with justice this way. And you should try, you know, doing that up in New York. And it's pretty blatant in that one.
And there's that kind of, I forget the exact quote, but it's basically saying about, like, you know, how it's like the Old West, right? Where, you know, basically, like, you're responsible for your justice and stuff. That's like kind of one of the things that, like, is reflected of, like, you know, where it pretty much shows, like, kind of how, especially the original version, it's very much like a Western, you know, like kind of where you if you don't take the law into your own hands, then nobody else is going to do it, you know, for you and stuff. And because, like, you know, you're basically in a lawless society and everything otherwise and stuff, which is kind of interesting how, you know, on the one hand, you know, it starts off in New York, one of the most modern cities in the world, but yet, like, there's this sense of lawlessness, you know, there's a sense of being on a you know, frontier and everything. And I guess back in the 70s, that was like a period of, like, kind of where crime was at an all-time high. So, you know, to some degree, there was this kind of, I don't know, there's something about that aspect, though, that did reflect this kind of Old West mentality and stuff.
And I think the point you made is really, it's kind of quite obvious, but until you really think about it, but he is basically a psychopath, and that's what makes him so effective. And it also sort of makes this point of who would have been the most effective at surviving in the West would probably be someone who has very high sociopathic, psychopathic tendencies.
That's true.
And it makes you wonder how many successful people in America and that kind of thing were actually had very strong psychopathic tendencies. I mean, I think also as well in terms of the films, the 74 is a much more uncompromising movie in that respect. It's like, this guy's going to go out and kill people and we're just watching him do this. And whereas they kind of, again, it's the usual thing, because we understand psychopathy a lot more. The 2017 one, they kind of round off the hard edges a little bit and they say, well, he's actually getting revenge and he's trying to do it in a kind of a conscientious way. Whereas in Charles Bronson in the 74 one, he's just going out looking for trouble at night and shooting whoever. I mean, I think that's the other thing that's really telling us, he doesn't let anyone get away. He's like, I'm going to just chase this person, hunt them down and shoot. Which is like, it's pretty merciless.
Yeah, I mean, that's one aspect of it that is kind of really amazing, that here we have a, quote unquote hero that, unlike the, superheroes, right, that like we typically see, that like there is this kind of, mercy and at a, after a certain point that like, enough is enough kind of thing and stuff. Whereas like, with Charles Bronson, there's like kind of no stopping him until like he's, basically brought down, like kind of, his prey, like kind of, and that's really what it becomes. It's a, hunter kind of prey kind of thing. And, he's basically just hunting these criminals down.
Yeah. But the other thing was, we had no problem with that in the 80s. Like, you had movies that were just like, he's a killing machine bent on revenge. Right. And it's like, oh, cool, we're going to go and watch him kill lots of people. It's like, there were lots of movies like that in the 80s. Now when it's kind of like, we realize, okay, we can't just go and watch a psychopath for 2 hours, there has to be something more to it. But it's just interesting how, they have to weave the story around these kind of things a little more, and they do that in a much more measured way. But I mean, I suppose when you talk about the sort of things that people do as a result of watching, well, maybe not as a result of watching TV, I'm thinking like school shootings, other things like this, are these a result of us sort of celebrating remorseless killing in some degree in the media over the years? That's a bigger point. I don't know, you can argue it both ways, but
yeah, I mean, like that's another thing that kind of has gone both ways, where we seem to have, more of these, like kind of active shooter kind of things and stuff. Like where just somebody like kind of, like, I mean, even the term, right, going postal has entered our vernacular and stuff. And that's something that like, was pretty much unheard of in probably the 70s and early 80s and stuff. But it became more and more kind of, I don't know, it seemed like that's something that kind of became more in our awareness / kind of, mindset and stuff, that's like part of life, and stuff that, and I think, like some people, and that's what's interesting, right? Like kind of, here we have a film that, basically it's kind of pushing the gun control kind of agenda, right? Where, like basically, like kind of, everybody, needs to have a gun to kind of, defend their home and stuff like that. And meanwhile, like, I mean, what's kind of the argument, the counter argument is that like, well, that's why there's more of these kind of shootings in school. That's why there's more of these kind of, people kind of, going nuts and, kind of public places and stuff. So it's like kind of, I don't know. It seems like one of those issues that we can kind of go round and around with and stuff. And then meanwhile, like, I guess Eli Roth is the director for the remake and stuff. His point was that like, he's not like kind of pushing the right wing agenda at all. He's saying that like his stance is that like, hey, I'm just basically telling a story, and that's relevant to today and stuff like that. That's the way his approach is.
And I thought that was interesting. He definitely covers. He shows you actually the mechanisms of how you go about owning a gun and
Yeah.
what the approval process is, which is something they don't even they touch about. It's obviously changed since the 70s, but yeah, there was a lot of that. There was even there were lots of kind of interesting touches of that, added this sort of realism in the 2017 one of like, how to actually hold a gun properly to shoot it in order that you don't, cut your hand so they do a very good job of showing how he actually learns to do, to shoot and to do all these sort of things. And likewise, the technology is trying to, he's tried to incorporate that into how would a vigilante story work in the 21st century. I mean, I did think, though, to be a little critical of it, he touches on technology everywhere, but this rich family with the doctor as the father, they don't have like a video ring system anywhere in the house. Yeah, no kind of video surveillance, no alarms for like going outdoors. That was that wasn't a little unrealistic. But the dangers of getting an Uber, and people using your address, things like this. Privacy kind of laws came into it, which was kind of interesting. People filming crimes. He had the people filming him doing stuff. Then the social media thing, and that's one actually. Sorry, another thing I think is a weird sort of mirror of both versions was. There's the scene with Charles Bronson after he's done a few of his sort of vigilante killings. He's got all the magazines that mentioned the vigilante. Now in that one, I almost felt like his magazines were like his trophies of his kill almost.
Yeah.
And whereas in the 2017 one, it's almost like he's enjoying the fame that he's receiving, or he's kind of getting into the whole social media hype around his vigilante. So. Yeah, there were two different kind of slightly things, but similar in a way.
Yeah, I think, as we kind of mentioned earlier, I feel that like the Bruce Willis character, we're a lot more sympathetic because he at least seems to have some human feelings, like kind of, that like, in fact, like kind of, again, spoiler alert, that like he, like kind of in theory, like kind of, has kind of, quit, like kind of that's at least like, what he says. But of course, like, there's this kind of hint of, like kind of that he's going to continue when like at the very end, like kind of, there's this kind of criminal, like kind of, trying to walk off with somebody's stuff and everything like that. And he does the same Charles Bronson, like kind of, gotcha kind of, thing and stuff. So I think that was interesting how on the one hand, like, whereas, Charles Bronson clearly, like he's just going to continue in Chicago, and that's another interesting flip too, where Bronson starts in New York and ends up in Chicago, and then Bruce Willis starts off in Chicago and ends up in New York with his daughter and stuff like that.
That's right. Yeah. Interesting. I didn't pick up on that. Yeah.
So, but I think that's the thing that's interesting, that like both cases, they're seem to just be going to continue their I don't know, like their duty, I guess, or their like their occupation of or side occupation of being a vigilante and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you can kind of look at them as controversial tales of self-actualization. In that they seem to be, like we said, they seem to have sort of transformed as people by the end of it, but transformed through the mode of killing people, basically. So, yeah.
In both cases, too, though, they definitely hit the, I've mentioned him a few times with this guy who kind of writes about kind of screenwriting and stuff, Blake Snyder, and it's this thing called Save the Cat, where there's apparently like 13 beats that like, all these stories kind of have to have. And among them is like kind of, like the fun and games kind of thing, which is like basically where, in both stories, you see them kind of just going nuts, like kind of going to town with like killing, the criminals and stuff like that. And then of course, like kind of things catch up to with them and stuff. And that like, the authorities start getting closer and everything like that. And then there's this kind of, showdown and stuff, with that kind of these, real baddies and everything. And I think that was one interesting aspect about the new version is that in that case, it's a, you know, full on like kind of, you know, you know, and again, we have like the kind of Western aspect of that, like it's a showdown. It's like kind of, you know, basically like, you know, in that case, it's Bruce Willis kind of basically, he's in his house and like kind of, you know, the criminals are coming after him and stuff like that. But he's, you know, he's going to bring them all down and stuff.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
I think that was one interesting aspect about the new version is that in that case, it's a, you know, full on like kind of, you know, you know, and again, we have like the kind of Western aspect of that, like it's a showdown. It's like kind of, you know, basically like, you know, in that case, it's Bruce Willis kind of basically, he's in his house and like kind of, you know, the criminals are coming after him and stuff like that. But he's, you know, he's going to bring them all down and stuff.
It's like a Home Alone for grown-ups almost. But yeah, like a siege. Whereas with Charles Bronson, there isn't that. But the other thing I think is kind of interesting is this way of how when you talk about the authorities catching up with them in the 2017, it's sort of they play it off like, well, we kind of know it's this guy, but we're not going to get him because we know he's generally okay, and you know, we as police may want to, we almost like want to act like him a little bit as well to some degree.
Right.
And in the 70s version, it's actually they throw it in this more sort of political direction, in that you know, he's making such an impact on the mugging that we as a society would rather just not accept that this kind of, we don't mind it, but we're going to let it kind of carry on because of the effect. So it's almost like they're the police commissioner and the DA are almost a representation of this kind of subconscious draw of it, in that we know we kind of would like to do it this way, but we can't really show to be supporting this kind of vigilantism.
Right. And I thought that's kind of somewhat realistic of how, you know, like that the system, different times, they feel handcuffed by like kind of the rules that they have to play by and stuff. And different times where, you know, we don't want to be known as a society that supports revenge and stuff. You know, we want to, of course, it goes back to the idea that like, you know, we want to like, you know, basically be a just society and stuff. And yet in reality, different times, like kind of between like our feelings, like you said, as human beings, that like, you know, we just want to just, you know, nail the bastards, that kind of, you know, that kind of feeling, that kind of idea. Other times, you know, it's also like interesting how they're making that political decision based on the fact that like, you know, they can't, like you said, they can't have the appearance of like supporting it. But meanwhile, like kind of, you know, they were trying to basically play it off like, or it had the public face of like kind of saying like, you know, oh, we don't condone this at all, and you know, like kind of this person has to stop and stuff like that. But behind the scenes, they're saying, well, actually, you know, like kind of, you know, crime is down, and you know, like it's good for kind of, you know, it's good for what's called making the streets safer. So carry on.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a family that works in law enforcement, and I mean, they say there is a fundamental thing of, you know, I'm every day I'm putting my life on the line, and I have to follow all these rules. People will film me with cameras, and I'm trying to help everyone. But it's way easier for the criminal just to kind of start randomly firing, and you know, we've got to protect ourselves while we're trying to do this. The natural urge is just to shoot back, you know. But it's not that simple, obviously, and it's not easy. I don't think by any stretch. Right.
Yeah, I mean that's something that like we've kind of gotten into too, where you know, like kind of with like Vietnam, right, where different times like kind of, you know, our troops are kind of hamstrung by like kind of the rules of engagement and stuff, and then, you know, like kind of likewise, you know, like kind of our law enforcement, like, you know, God love them, like the different times they're, you know, basically they you know, like kind of sometimes they probably just want to make things a lot simpler, just by like kind of just, you know, being the same thing of like judge, jury, and executioner, but of course, like, you know, they have to like kind of read the person Miranda rights, and they have to like kind of, you know, probably different times, like, you know, fire a warning shot, you know, different times and stuff, or, you know, other rules that probably like, you know, probably much too much to kind of get into here, but it's, yeah, I can imagine, like you said, it's the rules are simpler for the criminals and stuff, because they just, like kind of whatever kind of allows them to get away or allows them to kind of, like kind of stop the threat to them and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of Dirty Harry as well as a movie, which is a similar kind of time period, where he is basically judge, jury, and executioner, but in that case, he's actually a cop. And but there's definitely the same kind of draw for both movies. And I actually think somewhere people watching things like Judge Judy and even daytime TVs that deal with sort of law and justice, and why people follow these things is because there's a part of you that thinks, oh, I would like to be the judge. I'd like to be the person that sort of brings the hammer down on these people, or would like to sort of, make the call on it as well.
Right. I mean, that's kind of like a lot to do with like when we read the news and stuff like that, and we like kind of roll our eyes like kind of at a decision where somebody gets off on technicalities. That's probably the tropes that in these crime procedurals like that we really kind of on one hand cringe at, but the other we kind of realize it's so true that like the a lot of times the system does fail us, of where the criminals are kind of get off because of technicalities and stuff. And the antidote sometimes to us, or the simpler solution, is having like a Dirty Harry or a Charles Bronson that basically like hey, kind of you have a bad day in court, no problem, go duke it out in the street and stuff, and then that'll solve all your worries with this criminal and stuff. Yeah,
another sort of thing, going back to another movie we talked about, I guess, is John Wayne. I can't remember the name of it now. When we watched
True Grit,
True Grit, because he's a similar kind of character.
That's
he's
right.
Unconcerned by his day in court.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, just on more general terms, which one did you actually prefer?
I have to say that, like, the newer one for me was more satisfying because of the overall thing where it's on one hand I think you felt more sympathetic with Bruce Willis and the fact that like he actually ended up kind of taking out the criminals who did all this to his family. Kind of that was more satisfying versus the original where I don't even know if he ever came close to getting those criminals. Like, he didn't even really know who they were. And so that kind of, if anything, just made it even more like kind of less satisfying because of the fact that like, he kills all these people and, like kind of what did that really, accomplish and stuff, right? Yeah, I mean, if anything, it was more frustrating, I felt like, with Charles Bronson and stuff because of that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I liked how they remade it, and I actually thought it was much better than I expected. Sorry, that's our plant feeding mechanism going off in the background there. But and I thought there was clever the way that they tried to weave in all the technological things, but it all felt a little bit too kind of contrived. And but I'm going to try and mention this here. I'm going to try and mention gun control. I'm going to try and mention Uber. Right. It all felt a bit kind of crammed in, and the fact that he did sort of just find the original criminals, and it all kind of had a nice kind of bow that was tied at the end, a bit like a TV movie. But I mean, fair play to Eli Roth. He did a pretty good job there, I would say. I'm normally pretty harsh on people remaking movies. I mean, the 70s one, though, I much prefer. For nothing else, the Herbie Hancock soundtrack is pretty amazing all the way through. I love that. Been sampled in lots of other hip hop and things like this. Have you ever heard the track "Another Mother" by the Herbalizer? That actually takes lots of sections out of Death Wish and puts it into a track. It's pretty cool, actually. But that, and I mean, Michael Winner is quite an interesting filmmaker because he almost went on to become like a reality TV star in the UK. After he was making, he's made all sorts of movies. He's kind of one of those sort of random English people that found their way into filmmaking in Hollywood. But yeah, no, I kind of, in some sort of way, I find the uncompromising celebration of psychopaths more kind of intriguing as a concept in the 70s one. So I think I kind of preferred that one, just because it's kind of one of those things like why am I enjoying this when you're watching it? But yeah, so that was it for me. There was one thing that you mentioned that has leading me onto something, and that is the fact that he doesn't really pursue the original criminals, or there's no kind of tying in there. And one thing I've noticed on a lot of these remakes is that movies from the 70s or earlier, they often have random acts of brutality that often go kind of unresolved.
Yeah.
And in more recent movies, it's like we don't tend to have as much of that. It's almost like that's a bit too close to the truth for us to deal with in a movie. And in a way, it kind of makes me think about how we view our dreams, and I'm getting very kind of deep into it now. But when you dream, you're kind of trying to make a narrative of random things that have happened in your dream. That's sort of what happens in a very short period of time. And I kind of feel like movies also sort of represent this to a degree. And it's almost like, as a society, we don't want to allow random acts of brutality, so we try and thread narrative sort of themes through them.
I think also it's a reflection of how things have changed to the degree where, like probably like something that happened more in the 70s and thereabouts. Again, this gets back into Mindhunter, is that like there were a lot of these unsolved crimes, or a lot more, I think. Whereas, like kind of fast forward to like over these past years, there's a lot more of like kind of the DNA testing, the database now that, the central database that we have for criminals and stuff. Whereas back then, like kind of, you can have some crime out in the boonies that, nobody ever really tracks, nobody ever hears about and stuff. And it's just kind of lost in some, kind of paper file and everything like that. Whereas now, like kind of since then, anything that's kind of done is a blip in some database that is connected to another database and stuff that we're going to hear about in some way, or somebody can find, much more easily. So I think that's another kind of thing that's shifted in these past years and stuff. And I think that's kind of one of the things that, I think that's kind of where, along with the kind of the other things you mentioned about the changes in technology, the whole science for forensics and all that has really changed, in these past years as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have I'm not in any way informed about statistics of crime or law enforcement, but you would expect that there would be less unsolved crimes these days than there were, say, in the 70s. I mean, I don't really know if that's true or not. But
yeah, I mean, that's not to say that, like, it's perfect by any stretch, because, like, certainly one of the things that, like, a lot of the, the real people in law enforcement that I've known and stuff like that, they all say, like, kind of the stuff you see, like, on a CSI, whatever, it's a little much, like, kind of, they kind of also make it a little bit like science fiction in some ways.
Oh yeah, and if you want something really creative, you might want to watch NCIS, and their interpretation of IT is quite amazing. All you need is 2 large containers of like some highly caffeinated soda, and you can hack through any firewall in like 30 seconds.
Right.
It's always, I always love watching those scenes and those. I mean, yeah, they're always quite fun.
I thought that like one thing that was interesting too, that with both versions, is that the wives in both cases are like kind of these very wholesome kind of women, right? Like the original Hope Lange, this is like kind of, the Ghost of Mrs Muir, right? When Mrs Muir like kind of is like the one that's attacked. And then now in the modern version, we have, Allie from Karate Kid, right? Elizabeth Shue, who's attacked, like kind of and killed and stuff like that. So both cases we have like kind of, these women that are like kind of almost ideals of like kind of, like very much, motherly / kind of wives that like, we just kind of, the very idea of somebody like that being attacked, much less killed, is like kind of just abhorrent. Just something that like, it kind of basically hits home even more.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say the scene in the 70s one is it's in a way less sort of happens, I suppose, but it's kind of slightly more shocking in a way than the more modern one. and going back to the random brutality kind of thing, with we've developed over the years this thing. If you're in a situation where you've been taken hostage, at least how movies portray this is that you have to do something stupid in order to get killed. It's like if you sit there and you're completely passive and you just do exactly what you're told, your chances of survival is going to be that much higher. You know, that's definitely how movies portray it. Whereas, I mean, the reality could just be that, well, people are going to kill you or do whatever anyway.
Yeah.
But the 70s one is much more just like, well, these guys are just going to do this anyway. Too bad, you're dead. And that's it.
Yeah, I guess apparently the old wisdom was to, you know, like you said, to be complicit and to not, like, under resistance, stuff like that. Just give them your money and that kind of thing. And I've heard actually, like, you know, kind of some different, you know, people who talk about self-defense that, like, you know, your best chances of survival is, like, in the first few seconds to do something active and stuff and to just get away or to, like, you know, just to, you know, like, if you, or just sit there and stuff, you're basically dead. Like, kind of, you know, that's my understanding. Like, you know, you not necessarily like kind of, you know, if somebody's got a gun on you, not necessarily kind of, you know, make a quick movement or whatever, but, you know, you've got to like kind of think fast and kind of, you know, act fast, like kind of in the first few seconds though, or that's pretty much over from what I understand and stuff like that. So. Yeah,
interesting. Again, not something I know a huge amount about. Thankfully, I've not had to. But,
right.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting takes on. And the other thing is, of course, is we like to storify any crime as well. So it's and now with social media, we document and we storify our lives much more than we would have done in the 70s. So any kind of sort of criminal now has to sort of have like a story arc, because of course we have True Life TV that makes narratives out of just crimes essentially. So there's certain expectations we have now that everything has a motive and everything has a reason, and there's a psychological route, or there's they're after the money or something like that. Whereas and an interesting early role for Jeff Goldblum. I was totally unexpected to see him as one of the. That was really bizarre. Seeing him as a kind of a sort of mugger stroke rapist. It's not really a role that you associate him with.
Right. So. It does seem. I don't know. Like partly because of our associations now with them, it totally seems out of place and stuff. At the same time, though, he played it, pretty much to the hilt. I mean, he was. Very much like kind of, what you would expect this kind of random criminal to be like and stuff. And, he did, stand out even then, like kind of in that role. I thought that was interesting as well.
Yeah, it was very noticeable. And I mean, I looked on IMDb at the other two muggers and absolutely there was no noticeable career for them after that. But it's just interesting how, how people get picked up and other people don't in the movie industry. But, yeah.
And I think probably the other thing that we see is this kind of thing between, perception and reality of crime, where like kind of certainly in this country, it's almost like kind of between the media and also even kind of, the political scene. We're kind of told that like crime is, rampant even more and stuff like that. But in reality, like kind of, crime is like kind of, when you look at the actual hard statistics, it's the lowest it's been probably since, before the 70s. I mean, that's kind of like what's, is also really fascinating is the perception that we have, like kind of with Fox News and all that. But when you look at the actual numbers, it's not really supported, like kind of, so I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like when you listen to people like Steven Pinker, who does global statistics on how things, everything is generally getting better. We feel like we're bombarded with all this information of these terrible things that are happening, but on average, everything is considerably better than it was. When you have a slogan like "Make America Great Again," you may not, it's much greater than it was back then. Look at the murder rates in the 80s and the 90s in major cities. You're much better off now.
Yeah, and the funny part too is, with the Freakanomics folks, that they basically had that one report where they pointed out how, like, you know, what they see as like kind of the root cause of like kind of drop in crime isn't any kind of measures or this or that kind of, you know, but actually just, you know, the legalizing of abortion and stuff, which is really controversial, you know, kind of that, like, to say something like that. But, you know, you have to kind of wonder, though, that, like, kind of, you know, where it kind of makes sense in another sense of, like, where if you have more kind of, or less kind of unwanted, you know, pregnancies, less kind of, you know, teens or whatever running out in the streets and stuff like that, to some degree, I mean, that's just simply sheer numbers that, like, you know, you can't argue with, like, kind of that aspect of it, even if you say that, like, it's not because of abortion or whatever. But, you know, it's kind of like just simply the I don't know, the sheer numbers aspect of it makes it where it's really in control. You know, you almost just can't argue it, I guess, in some respects.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people that make the argument for that, you know, it would have in certainly the rest of the world, you know, a big effect on climate change and things like this. It would, yeah, I mean, we're in radical leftist territory there, but yeah, interesting.
And you know, like, for that same kind of story, they kind of, you know, kind of basically pointed to the flip side of it, where I guess the one, you know, despot of, you know, like, kind of, what was it, Romania, whatever, that he made abortion illegal, so there was more births, and then subsequent to that, there was, like, kind of this uprising that led to his downfall and stuff like that. so you also had that opposite effect, I guess.
There you go. Yeah.
And I guess that's
what you wish for.
Right. And I guess that's kind of the different thing that's kind of interesting as well, is, like, kind of unintended effects of stuff like that, which I think that kind of, you know, definitely leads to kind of this idea in the end, though, of, you know, like, on one hand, you know, in both cases, this, you know, vigilante kind of gets away and stuff like that. And then, you know, meanwhile, they're going to be going back out in the streets probably, right? Like, kind of, you know, so it is, in fact, like, kind of just a matter of time before either one, they get killed themselves, or they kill somebody who, you know, by mistake and stuff like that. Because, you know, that's one of the things we don't see, is that, like, you know, which happens a lot, is that some innocent bystander gets in the way. Like, you know, like in some circumstance, you know, somebody may very well be, like, kind of, you know, he may be intending to shoot the criminal and trying to save the person and stuff, but meanwhile, the criminal throws the victim in front of him, and then, you know, ends up, you know, Charles Bronson or Bruce Willis ends up killing, you know, this person they were trying to help and stuff. So that's, you know, we don't see that in any of the movies, but that can very well happen at some point.
I'm trying to think, actually, if there's any movies where, you know, the vigilante is unsuccessful generally, or gets killed, or gets somebody innocent killed, you know, in what he's trying to do.
Right.
I mean, you don't see Batman using people as a human shield, or, you know.
Yeah, you can't, you know, like, or you can't have that, right, with, you know, that hero, like, kind of makes that kind of move, or that kind of mistake and stuff. And whereas in real life, that's...
I'm sorry, yeah. What can I say, guys? It's plants. They need water, they need nutrients. So, yeah.
And, you know, like, in real life, it's probably more likely to be the case, though, that somebody at some point is just going to just, you know, just be in the way. That's kind of just, you know.
And I think this is the thing when people, I mean, again, talking about family members in law enforcement, is these split-second decisions are the things that people don't appreciate when you're trying to look at these cases of, you know, where a policeman looks like he's made the wrong decision or something, you know, because, you're talking very, very quick time frames, and you've got to make life or death decisions, or you've got to make a decision that affects your own life or death. You know, it's not easy.
Yeah, they have these, you know, obstacle courses, right, where it's different times like a silhouette of a criminal, and then other times a silhouette of a civilian and stuff. And, you know, probably, like, you know, half the time, like, kind of, you know, these poor, you know, kind of police candidates, or you know, these trainees go through it, then they end up shooting like kind of the silhouette of a civilian, because it's like kind of you only had, like you said, that split second to kind of make that decision, to make the call. And it's it's not a video game in the sense where, like, different times it's not so easy in a kind of that moment and stuff, the heat of the moment, if you will.
And I mean, if my performance in video games is anything to go by, my judgment calls, I would make a pretty atrocious policeman. I'd probably be right, maybe slightly worse than Charles Bronson in my justice meting out. So yeah. So any further thoughts on Death Wish? Any more Death Wishes you want to? Could you sit through 2? I started to watch 3, and yeah, they get noticeably worse.
Oh, really?
Just from watching the first half an hour ago, I was like, yeah, it doesn't quite have the edge of the 70s one, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of nailed it in the head that there is this kind of vicarious thrill to it. There is some aspect that like kind of really makes it where we really feel for somebody who like kind of just decides like enough is enough, and I think we all have had that feeling of different times, like wanting to kind of just like that person like is no longer a person. Then that's like somebody who I'm going after and stuff. There was one movie that like didn't do it so much in the sense of like being like kind of this going after the person in the sense of like wanting to kill them. I forget the name of it, but it was a Samuel L. Jackson and then Ben Affleck movie where basically it's just more like kind of the person wanting to kind of like get revenge, like in a sense of like kind of wanting to kind of ram their car or something like that, which like kind of, I mean, that's sometimes something I think anybody who's been on the road, that road rage thing is very real and stuff. Sometimes you do want to go after that person who like just basically has been a real kind of lack of a better word, dick about things and stuff. So I think we've all been there, and I think it's a yet another aspect of these kind of revenge fantasies we have and stuff. But in reality, of course, being in kind of the kind of society kind of preserving order and stuff like that, we kind of just wouldn't do something like that. And so I think that's the thing that like through these movies, as we've talked about, sometimes we are living out these fantasies and stuff that like we in real life wouldn't do and stuff like that. And I guess by that extension, it's also kind of like you said with video games, it's yet another way we try to like kind of live out these fantasies that we wouldn't do in real life and stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, certainly you're right. There's a lot of Old Testament justice in road rage. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, the only other thing I was going to mention, which was kind of interesting for me, was that the actual performance that Charles Bronson has as the protagonist, he's quite an understated character, but he has a real kind of gravitas in his role. And I just reading on, he's actually like he won a Purple Heart, not one, but he received the Purple Heart for his service in World War II. So he was obviously a pretty sort of hardened veteran of the military. And there's something that there's definitely a kind of a collected calmness that comes across in the film.
Right.
He's clearly been in, this is nothing new for him.
Right.
Which comes across quite obviously, I think.
Definitely. Like you definitely see it in kind of, like you said, the way he carries himself, the way that like kind of, he just like, in that moment, there's just kind of truth to it that like we see like kind of, the way he kind of, basically is looking at kind of the individuals and stuff and staring down the barrel and everything, and and we definitely kind of get that sense that like he's the real deal. Yeah,
absolutely.
So I think coming up, we like one of the kind of revenge movies we may look at is probably will look at some point is Ben-Hur. So that's kind of like another more. And it's funny how that is a very biblical kind of revenge story, I guess.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. Tying it into the Old Testament, sort of.
And then I think some of the other kind of more justice movies, I think, let's see. well, I don't know about justice, but kind of revisiting horror. We definitely, you know, kind of have Dawn of the Dead as another one that we will be looking at. And then, of course, you know, after The Thing, we kind of talked a little bit about the idea of like revisiting Invasions of Body Snatchers and this kind of Cold War kind of bent to it and stuff. So just kind of a little bit of a heads up of what's coming up in the next few. We'll kind of definitely let you know what the next one is and stuff. So once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Thanks very much.
And as always, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment, and we'll see you next time.